4-star units can be tricky when it comes to balancing gacha games. Given their lower rarity in relation to 5 stars, subsequently making them more accessible, it wouldn't make any sense for them to have the same strength as the more elusive, more expensive ones. Exceptions can apply, but rule of thumb, 4-star has less stuff than 5-star. Very simple. But that doesn't necessarily mean if you had to choose between one or the other, the latter would always be the most viable option. While it's true that on average you're more likely to see 5 stars dominating the meta, it's not only reasonable but essential for there to at least be some 4 stars up there as well so as not to create a very top-heavy game state. And Honkai Star Rail, like its predecessor, has done a fairly decent job at giving us a number of good 4 stars to work with. Harmony Trailblazer, again I consider them a 4 star, March 8, Gallagher, Tingyun, and Pela to name a few. And I have high expectations that future releases will also get balanced accordingly. You'll notice, however, none of these characters are explicitly damage dealers. As of version 2, only 2 4-star DPS units have come out, Misha and just recently Moze, neither of whom are topping records. Which brings me to our topic for today. If supports are able to do comparatively well, why aren't damage dealers doing the same? If this sounds familiar to you, it's because I made a similar piece for 4-star units in Genshin Impact, only I feel like it might be even more difficult for 4-star DPS characters to find gainful employment in Star Rail, and in this video we'll be going over why. Building off what I said earlier, the notion of 4 stars being weaker than 5 stars is a simple question of mathematics and cost benefit. If in 100 pulls you can reliably get one 5-star character and, like what, 10 4 stars, then logically the 5-star character should be more valuable. Now rarity doesn't always have to correlate with strength. Tons of video games have Easter egg items, equipment and whatnot that are exceedingly rare but offer little if any practical benefit to the party. In gachas however, with characters being acquired usually through their purchase of premium currency, there needs to be practical backing behind it for the sheer fact that there's a tangible cost to obtain it, a rather steep cost at that. Gacha games have arguably the worst return on investment in regards to playtime for the amount of money whales tend to spend on it. Point being, 4-star characters are easier to obtain and as such, they're given lower parameters and capabilities than their 5-star counterparts to rationalize the cost of said 5-star, but to ensure they're still viewed as desirable and also to provide fair opportunity for those who don't have the wherewithal to pull for every SSR, 4 stars need to still be viable and practical to an extent. So the ideal goal is to make a 4-star weaker than a 5-star while still giving them reasonable value. At the beginning of Star Rail, they did a fairly decent job with that. Early supports like Tingyun, Pela, and Asta were on a level playing field with that of 5 stars, Bronya, Luocha, Silver Wolf, and stuff. Surprisingly, even DPS-wise, we had a lucky, or should I say unlucky candidate, Qingche, whose gimmicky playstyle was actually good enough to be a match for the top tiers at the time. Of course, the majority of 4 stars, damage-oriented ones in particular, weren't really much to write home about. Danheng, Serval, Hook, Arlen, Zushang, Sampo, what semblance of usefulness they didn't have just about vanished in only a few patches. But thanks to Qingche's efforts, and by that I mean her laziness, Star Rail was able to find that balance of there being 4 stars who were just good enough. On the support side of things, that quota has been steadily maintained all throughout version 2. Gallagher in tandem with Harmony MC has allowed for a very strong foundation for the break engine, and a change of clothing for March was all she needed to become a serviceable dual support for either break or follow-up attacks. But on the DPS side of things, not only has Qingche fallen off in relevance as a result of there being far more options than we've ever had before, but the new 4-star options we've been given to presumably update that category have frankly been mediocre. Despite playing an unexpectedly integral role in the Panaconi storyline, from a gameplay standpoint, Misha is an underwhelming unit. Briefly going over his kits and stumbling to bet most people don't even know what he does, the gist is that his ultimate can deal X amount of hits, which you can increase with the rest of his abilities, skill granting 1 extra hit and talent granting an extra hit whenever anyone on the team burns SP. The way he benefits from that is that on top of doing more damage, each attack of Misha's ultimate has a small chance to freeze the enemy, so by getting more hits in, the likelihood of actually landing a freeze goes up to the point where it's essentially guaranteed, and given his ultimate being a bounce attack, it can theoretically freeze the entire enemy lineup. Credit where it's due, if your goal is to pull off some kind of freeze-oriented strategy, you have a fairly consistent one right here, and when fighting just one enemy, concentrating all those attacks onto a single target means getting them frozen is a foregone conclusion. Not only that, but with each hit of his ultimate doing 10 toughness damage and capping at 10 hits, Misha can potentially deal some of the highest toughness damage in the game. It's not like he's entirely without potential. What has him permanently benched though is twofold. 1. Nothing he does fulfills a role that hasn't been covered in the past. If your goal is to make a freeze-oriented attacker, Misha does nowhere near enough damage for that to actually matter. If your goal is to make a remembrance G-spot, everyone has March, and that's already a gimmicky strategy to begin with, not a meta one. By the time his potential as a breaker actually started to matter, being mostly suited for a single target, he was overshadowed instantly by Boothill. 2. Misha's kind of all over the place. He's a freeze-oriented guy, at the same time he's a burst stacker like Jingyuan, at the same time he's got room for super break, at the same time his E2 gives off the suggestion that he can be a debuffer, at the same time he's got SP regeneration for his team on E6. He's a jack of all trades character, which we've established only works if you're a master of all. By no means am I implying Misha is on the same level as Arlen, but it's a hard sell for the guy. His performance against a single enemy, where he's supposed to excel at, might be decent, but he's completely unusable in pure fiction because the point of that game mode is to kill stuff quickly, not freeze them. Perhaps if he came out back in version 1.0, he would have been a decent pick, but considering he came out at the start of version 2 when the game started throwing banger after banger at us, in relativity, Misha feels out of place. Now, let's talk about Moze. Moze's an interesting fellow. A lightning hunt unit with a follow-up attack target-oriented playstyle. Behaving in a similar fashion to Topaz, Moze can mark an enemy target and cause him and his teammates to deal extra damage to them, kinda like Teeny's Benediction, and every 3 times this happens he launches a follow-up attack on them. So while Topaz works off a summon, Moze is off the number of attacks. His skill lets you change who you want to mark while also giving you ammunition for that extra damage, and for his ultimate he deals a burst of damage and applies his talent's follow-up attack. It's debatable as to whether you want to call him an actual DPS character like Acheron or Danheng, or if you want to call him more of a backup DPS like March 8 or Topaz, but apart from his A2 trace boosting follow-up damage by 20%, he leans more towards being an attacker who coincidentally happens to work with other people, which is something I plan to cover more in detail later. Anyway, unlike Misha, Moze is a more focused character, having a very clear niche of getting a lot of attacks in, and by having this focus, he can actually contribute more for his team. So while he is a DPS character, there's room for him to play more of a backup dancer, so to speak. The 25% bonus follow-up attack damage on his A2 combined with the 40% crit damage boost on his E2 make him almost identical to Topaz in playstyle. This makes him a much more viable character since anyone with a follow-up attack oriented win condition has no shortage of party synergy, however that can also be a double-edged sword. Because the follow-up engine has so many characters in its roster, competition for party space is pretty steep, and Moze is nowhere close to being the first choice. Currently, based on early speculation by theory crafters, Moze's only real good use is in tandem with Facial, whose own gameplay primarily revolves around achieving a high quantity of attacks, with her ultimate being her bread and butter that also counts as a follow-up attack. What's kind of problematic here is that Moze came out just after March 8 did, who happens to be a strong follow-up attack-oriented support in her own right and even has the same thought process of wanting as many attacks as possible if you're going the follow-up route, only her SP economy is much better than his, so by and large, not unlike Misha, Moze comes off redundant. While March can avoid directly competing with Topaz courtesy of the other half of her focusing on break, Moze has no fallback, he's all follow-ups. And though having elemental coverage is always handy if in the event you need lightning follow-up attacks instead of fire, at the end of the day, Moze is 4-star Topaz more or less. If in the same niche, 5 stars will always be 4 stars, especially in the realm of dealing damage. It would be asinine for 4-star Danheng to be stronger than 5-star Danheng, or for Moze to be stronger than Topaz, for Misha to be stronger than Jingliu. That goes against the fundamental cost-benefit principle of gacha games. One way they could make 4 stars bridge that gap, however, is through a simple solution, power with the cost or condition. That's how Qingque BS'd her way to high tier in the early days. She could deal monstrous amounts of damage, but extremely unreliably. Your goal was to get as many empowered blast attacks off as possible, and to do that you had to rely on RNG, so while she lost to Scylla in a battle of consistency, if the dice rolled in her favor, she could occasionally do better. That's one way to do it. The other way to make a 4-star DPS work well is by having them tap into a niche that isn't currently dominated by many characters or by a popular 5-star, which is the main issue affecting Misha and Moze. Both of them entered a niche that already has someone or many occupying the top spot. In the case of Qingque, she was the only blast attacker in the game who had the same power ceiling that Scylla and Jingyuan did. The moment more blast attackers came out who were more consistent than her, she lost a lot of market share and will only continue to. What makes it so difficult is that Honkai Star Rail is a turn-based game with a very linear combat structure. There may be a variety of engines, but they all play around that same structure, which doesn't allow for as much nuance as one would expect. Take Lincha for example, if you're designing a healer who could do break damage, you're not exactly able to make her without it being at Gallagher's expense. I mean, I guess making her a different element would have been helpful, but in spite of that, the two are still at odds with each other. Gallagher was the top tier people saw him as prior to Linkshot because he was the only healer with break related stuff. So of course when a 5-star comes out with the same niche as him, people will ask how they measure against each other. That's not to say 5-stars aren't already being measured against other 5-stars, but being a 4-star character, your ceiling is kept in check by characters of higher rarities at the time, whereas said higher rarity characters don't have a ceiling, they can be as broken as Hoyo wants them to be. Supports can work around this a bit more easily because they can fit into more than just one party, so if you get pushed out of one team you can still find refuge in another. No such luck for DPS characters, it starts and ends with them. If the damage doesn't measure up to a competitive standard, they're just not worth building. You can't say, oh, they're easier to play because it's a turn-based game, you can literally sequence your actions. You can't say, oh, he has a unique mechanic because there are no unique mechanics in Star Rail, everything is part of a system. There might be some extensions like how Robin's a singer type character or how Harmony Trailblazer pioneered Super Break, but the scope of what you can pull off is pretty constrained. By consequence, most people are viewing Moze as a DPS support because that's the only role you can actually play him in. There's no point in playing him as a primary damage dealer since there are many better options than him. Realistically, I think it's impossible for 4-star main DPS characters to exist in Starl without infringing on the balance of 4-star and 5-star value. For supports, you can always mix and match different components like having a follow-up attacker who can also battery, or a healer who can also debuff, or a shielder who can also apply damage over time, but you can't really pull off a DPS unit like that. They pick a lane and stick to it for better or worse. Essentially, it's the same problem Genshin struggles with. March 8, Gallagher, Harmony MC, they're the Bennett, Xiangling, and Xingqiu of Starl. These are the only types of 4-stars who can work in a game like this. 4-stars just don't have the power budget to be the main character, they always have to play second fiddle. That's not a bad thing per se, being 4-stars, they were never intended to be the star of the show. But if that's the case, they shouldn't even bother releasing 4-star attackers at all. Starl isn't one to release bad characters. Every single character that came out since 2.0 has either been mid-tier or better. Like even Misha, if you care to invest in him, might be the best 4-star damage dealer in the game. Not that there's a whole lot of competition, but there just aren't that many incentives to want to invest in him, which might explain why they're no longer making any more 4-star DPS units. It's hard to make one who can stay within those boundaries but be compelling enough for you to go the distance with. At the same time, I feel like they should make an effort to, or at least try to release a 4-star character who can be the Qingque of version 2. Strong as but with a gimmick to it. The only question is, how? Hinotori made it work thanks to the lack of competition, but now we have so much competition and not that many empty spots left. It doesn't help that Starl is trying to push more multi-role characters either. I do have an idea though, it's something I thought about while doing maintenance on my characters. Acheron has a trace that gives her more damage based on the number of Nihility characters on a team. The Penacony set gives bonus damage to allies with the same element as the Holder. One thing you could try is a mono team. We have Mono Quantum serving as a lifeline for Seela and Qingque, keeping them just good enough to be a rogue strategy. There's still a possibility we can pull this off for 4-star DPS units by having a team comp so hyper-specific that it can actually work. Putting it simply, we forcibly remove any feasibility of someone else joining that role. Here's an example. We can create a 4-star DPS whose attack triples if they've been turn advanced by other characters. So you can do a triple advanced comp like Bronya, Sparkle, and Robin. It is a gimmicky strategy, but last I checked, Qingque was the gimmicky strategy, and it was good enough to be meta. For that matter, I'm aware there's still areas you can explore, like making a DPS who attacks based on how much and how many shields are on him, but the reward has to be worth the effort, and again, for a turn-based game as simple as Starl, I don't know if they can pull that off. Pragmatically, why would you waste all those resources on that when you can just take the straightforward approach and play Acheron or Fei Shao or Firefly? In essence, 4-star DPS characters are constantly haunted by the sentiment that even if they do have potential, it won't be enticing enough and can't be enticing enough to get more than a handful of players to give them a try. Although I suppose there's nothing wrong with 4-stars being more supporty and niche than meta. That's how they are in almost every gacha game, so there's no sense in fixing what isn't broken. I wonder though, what's going to happen when we get Hunter or Edition Trailblazer? Are they going to be damage dealers or supports? Probably the latter. But what about you guys? Do you think the game can push out a 4-star main DPS, or are they going to be more like March, Moze, and Gallagher? You're welcome to share in the comments down below. For now, if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at VarsFarum, join my Discord server, and check out my other Honkai style discussions if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.